It is the morning of March 15, 1903. The sun is rising over the ancient walled city of Sokoto in what is now northern Nigeria. Inside the palace, a sultan named Muhammadu Attahiru I is making a decision that will haunt history forever. Outside the city, a column of British soldiers is marching toward him. They carry 4 Maxim machine guns and 4 75mm artillery pieces. His army carries spears, arrows, and a few old Dane guns. He has a choice: surrender one of the greatest empire in West Africa, or fight. He chooses to fight. And what happens next will shock you. In the year 1804, one man sat in exile in a small settlement called Gudu, in what is now northern Nigeria, and made a decision that would shake the entire continent of West Africa. His name was Usman Dan Fodio. He was born on December 15, 1754 in the Hausa city-state of Gobia. He was not a soldier, he was a scholar, a poet, a preacher, a man who had spent decades teaching the poor, writing in Arabic and Fulani, and warning the kings around him that their corruption would one day cost them everything. Those kings did not listen, and so Usman Dan Fodio declared war. What followed was not just a military campaign, it was a revolution. Ordinary Hausa farmers who had been taxed into poverty picked up weapons. Fulani pastoralists who had been driven off their lands joined the movement. Scholars who had been silenced by corrupt rulers raised their voices again. Within 4 years, his forces had captured Katsina, Kano, and Gobia itself, killing the very sultan who had once tried to destroy him. By 1809, the entire Hausaland was under a single flag for the first time in history. The empire they built was called the Sokoto Caliphate, and by 1837, it stretched across over 1,000 miles of West Africa, from what is today Cameroon in the east to Burkina Faso in the west. It had a population of between 10 and 20 million people. It was one of the largest, most populous empire in West Africa. Historians called it the most prosperous region in tropical Africa. Usman Dan Fodio died on April 20, 1817, at the age of 62 in the city of Sokoto. He never called himself sultan. He preferred to remain simply a scholar, a man of God. His son, Mohammed Bello, took over, expanded the caliphate further, and made Sokoto one of the great intellectual and religious centers of the Islamic world. For nearly a century, the Sokoto Caliphate stood. But the world was changing, and somewhere across the ocean, men in suits and uniforms were drawing maps of Africa and arguing over who would take what. By the 1890s, 3 European empires were moving across Africa with an efficiency that should have frightened everyone watching: Britain, France, and Germany. They called it the Scramble for Africa. The people of Africa called it something else entirely. France had already conquered the Segu Empire in 1890. Germany was swallowing Cameroon. And Britain, having taken control of the Royal Niger Company's territories in 1900, was pushing northward with one target clearly in its sights: Sokoto. The man given the task of breaking the caliphate was Frederick Lugard, a cold and meticulous British officer who had already served in Afghanistan, East Africa, and Uganda. He was appointed the first High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria, and he had a plan. Lugard did not simply march in and start shooting. He was too clever for that. He spent years identifying the tensions between the various emirs of the caliphate and the central authority in Sokoto. Some emirs resented Sokoto, some had debts, some had rivals. Lugard offered each of them something: protection, recognition, power, in exchange for cooperation. He picked the caliphate apart, emirate by emirate, like a man carefully pulling threads from a cloth before the whole thing unravels. By 1901 and 1902, he had taken Kontagora, Yola, Muri, Borche, Gom, and Zaria. Some emirs fought, some fled, some collaborated and kept their thrones. The ones who resisted were exiled. Several ended up dying in Lokoja, far from their homelands. And Lugard sent letters to Sokoto, official proclamations, demands that the Sultan recognize British sovereignty over the Caliphate. The Sultan at the time, Caliph Abdurrahman, received one such letter, read it aloud to his counselors, and sent the British messenger back without a single word of reply. He had nothing to say to people who had come to rule him. Then in October 1902, Abdurrahman died, and the weight of the entire crumbling empire fell onto a man who had been watching these events with fury and grief. His name was Muhammadu Attahiru I. Attahiru I was the 12th Sultan of the Sokoto Caliphate. He was a scholar, a deeply devout man, a grandson of the Caliphate's lineage, going all the way back to Usman Dan Fodio himself. He took the throne knowing that the British were already at the gates. He took the throne knowing that more than half of the Caliphate's southern emirates were already under colonial control. He took the throne anyway, and he made his position clear in a message to Lugard that has survived history like a burning coal. I do not consent that anyone from you should ever dwell with us. I will never agree with you. I will have nothing ever to do with you. Between us and you there are no dealings, except as between Muslims and unbelievers, war, as God Almighty has enjoined on us. There is no power or strength save in God on high. That was not a diplomatic statement. That was a man telling you exactly who he was. Lugard read it and turned to his military commanders. On January 31, 1903, a British column marched out of Zaria heading north. It was called the Kano-Sokoto Expedition, commanded by Colonel Thomas Morland. The force carried 800 African soldiers led by British officers, 4 75mm mountain guns, and Maxim machine guns. Their first target was Kano. Kano was not just a city, it was a legend. Its ancient walls stretched for miles. Its markets attracted merchants from across the Sahara. It was the jewel of Hausaland, a city that had stood for centuries. The emir of Kano, Aliyu Baba, had made a fatal mistake. He had left the city with most of his cavalry to consult with Sultan Attahiru I in Sokoto, leaving the city in the hands of a local noble called Madakin Kano. Madakin Kano gathered what forces he had and tried to hold the walls. His men were brave. They were also armed with weapons that were no match for British artillery. On February 3, 1903, Kano fell. 70 of its defenders were killed. The emir's cavalry, hearing the news, made a desperate long march back and were defeated again at the Battle of Kwatakwashi. The emir was captured and later exiled to Lokoja, where he would die in 1926, far from the city his family had ruled for generations. When the news reached Sokoto, it arrived like a death sentence. If Kano could fall, nothing was safe. Sultan Attahiru I called his council. The debate in that room was not a small one. Men who had advised caliphs for decades sat across from each other and argued over the hardest question any ruler can face. Do you fight a battle you cannot win, or do you leave before it destroys everything you love? Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to perform a hijra, a sacred migration, withdrawing from the land rather than submitting to foreign rule, following the tradition of the Prophet himself. The debate was still not settled when scouts arrived with news that British forces had already occupied Gwandu without resistance, established a camp at Shagari, and were now marching directly on Sokoto. The decision had been made for them. On the morning of March 13, 1903, before the British arrived, Attahiru I led his closest officials, his family, his court, and tens of thousands of ordinary people out of Sokoto. They walked east, singing the Shehu's Song of the Journey to the East, a hymn his great-grandfather had left behind for exactly this kind of hour. Women with children on their backs, scholars carrying manuscripts, soldiers on horseback, farmers on foot. The city they left behind was almost empty. On March 15, 1903, the British column arrived outside the walls of Sokoto. They crested a ridge and saw not an empty city, but an army waiting for them. Attahiru I had not simply fled. He had left a rearguard. He had left the men who chose to die rather than walk. Approximately 2,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry, armed with spears, arrows, and a few old Dane guns, stood in formation outside the city. The Caliph's army was arranged in 3 divisions. Attahiru I himself commanded the center. His general Ibrahim Sarkin Rabah held the left flank. Marafa Muhammadu Attahiru held the right. Before the battle began, a palace official called the Majidadi approached the Sultan and asked for the Goron Yaki, which translates as the kola nut of war. It was the old signal. It meant, "I am going out to die. Give me your blessing." The Sultan gave it. The Majidadi rode toward the British lines with his young squire, a teenage boy who refused to leave his side. Both were cut down by machine gun fire before they even reached the British column. Then the main battle began. The Sokoto cavalry charged the British flanks. The infantry advanced from the front. For a few minutes, the noise and the dust and the fury of it must have felt like something real. Then the Maxim guns opened up. Within 20 minutes, the assault was broken. Horses and men fell in heaps. The survivors regrouped around the Sokoto battle flag and fought to the last man before a British officer ripped it from the ground. About 100 Sokoto fighters died on that ridge. British casualties were just 2 carriers wounded and 2 soldiers slightly hurt. One of the Sokoto generals rode to Attahiru I in the chaos and said, "Do not let the torch go out while you are holding it." He meant, if you die here, the line of Usman Dan Fodio dies with you. Attahiru I hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he allowed his bodyguards to lead his horse away. At 11 in the morning, the British marched into a largely deserted city. The greatest Islamic empire in West Africa was gone in a morning. On March 13, 1903, at Sokoto's Grand Market Square, the last waziri of the Caliphate stood before a British officer and officially conceded. On March 21, 1903, Lugard arrived in the city and installed a man named Muhammadu Attahiru II, a rival of the real Sultan, as the new puppet Sultan, with powers so stripped down they barely deserved the name. The Caliphate was gone. In its place, the Northern Nigeria Protectorate, a British colony by another name. But Attahiru I was still alive, and the British knew that as long as he breathed, the war was not over. What happened next was not what Lugard expected. Attahiru I and his followers moved east, through Zamfara, through Kano, through the heartland of the empire he had just lost, and at every town he passed, something extraordinary happened. People left. Not a few people, not a small crowd, entire communities, farmers abandoning their fields, merchants leaving their shops. In some districts of the Kano region, it was reported that at least half the population joined his procession. The British and the emirs, who were now collaborating with them, watched in disbelief as Attahiru's following grew to tens of thousands. These were not just warriors. They were ordinary human beings who had watched their world collapse and had decided they would rather walk into the unknown than stay and be ruled by strangers. There is something about that choice that is hard to fully explain unless you understand what the Sokoto Caliphate meant to the people who lived inside it. It was not just a political state. It was a way of life, a faith, a community, 100 years of shared history. And they were walking away from it, singing. The British gave chase. They had a simple order: capture or kill. During the pursuit, they killed at least 35 people across 6 separate skirmishes, ordinary men and women who were simply trying to join the Sultan's caravan. The British struck Attahiru's camp at Gwoni on May 17, opening fire with a Maxim gun and scattering his followers across the Gongola River, seizing their horses, camels, and supplies. Attahiru I sent a message to the British resident at Borchai, a man named C.L. Temple. In it, he said he had no wish to fight. He asked only to be allowed to travel in peace. Temple's reply was 3 words: unconditional surrender. Attahiru I did not surrender. He retreated to a fortified town called Burmi in the Gom Emirate, near what is today Bajoga in Gom State. It was a small town with defensive walls and a mosque at its center. Attahiru I had been making his way toward Mecca, following the path Usman Dan Fodio himself had prescribed for a time of invasion, but the British had cut him off. Burmi was where the road ended. The morning of July 27, 1903. At 11 in the morning, British artillery began shelling Burmi. The town's walls shook. Inside, Attahiru's men, many of them armed with nothing but spears, swords, and poisoned arrows, prepared to receive the assault. The British column was led personally by Major Francis Charles Marsh. As he advanced toward the walls, a Burmi defender drew a bow and loosed a single poisoned arrow. It struck Marsh in the thigh. He collapsed. 20 minutes later, while the battle was still raging around him, Major Marsh was dead. Even at the end, Burmi took one of theirs. The British broke through the walls and entered the town. What followed was not a battle in any clean military sense. It was hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets, around houses, in courtyards, near the mosque. Men fighting with the knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. Over 600 people were killed inside Burmi. The town was set on fire. When British soldiers searched through the bodies, they found Attahiru I. He was lying on the ground with 90 of his men piled around him, the last of his guard, who had placed their bodies between their sultan and the bullets. He was the 12th sultan of the Sokoto Caliphate. He had reigned for just 5 months. He had walked over 1,000 miles rather than bow, and in the end, he died on his feet. What the British did next is the part that history has not forgotten. They decapitated Attahiru's body. They took photographs of the severed head of the Sultan of Sokoto, and they distributed those photographs across northern Nigeria to, as the official British record put it, convince the diehards of the futility of fighting. The photographs spread, and instead of fear, they produced exactly what the British should have known they would produce: rage. Within months, Lugard was writing in his own reports about a series of local uprisings across the north, all of them inspired by the memory of Attahiru I. In March 1906, a community called Sataru, just 22 kilometers southwest of Sokoto itself, rose in open revolt. The British brought overwhelming force and destroyed the entire settlement. They erased it from the earth. In Lugard's own 1906 annual report, he wrote with cold satisfaction that it had demanded a signal and overwhelming victory for the restoration of our prestige. That is the language of a man who was afraid. By 1906, the last organized armed resistance in the north had been crushed. Lugard then spent the next 8 years building what he called indirect rule, using the emirs as administrators, preserving the surface of Islamic governance while hollowing out its power from within. In 1914, he amalgamated northern and southern Nigeria into a single country, a country that had never existed before, a country whose fault lines we are still living with today. Attahiru I's son, Mohammed Bello bin Attahiru, known as Maiwerno, eventually led the survivors of the Burmi movement eastward, crossing through Chad and into Sudan. Many of their descendants still live there today, in settlements near Khartoum, still connected by memory to a caliphate that fell in a burning town in Gom on a July morning in 1903. The tomb of Sultan Muhammadu Attahiru I lies today in Burmi, 4 kilometers from Bajoga in Gom state. It is a small, white-painted wall in the middle of farmland. For years, no tour guide watched over it. No government maintained it. The paint peeled. A single elderly man volunteered to sweep it clean each day without pay because he believed it deserved at least that much. Buried beside him, in the same ground, is Major Francis Charles Marsh, the British officer whose poisoned arrow wound killed him during the same battle. Two men who would never have met in any other life, buried a few meters apart in a field in Gom state, because the world in 1903 made their collision inevitable. The Sokoto Caliphate lasted 99 years. It was built by a man who believed deeply that power without justice was not power at all. It was destroyed by men who believed deeply that power without limits was simply called empire. 120 years later, the Sultan of Sokoto still exists. His title survives. His line survives. The descendants of Usman Dan Fodio are still there, still revered by tens of millions of Muslims across Nigeria. The British came, they conquered, they left. The caliphate they thought they had erased is still standing, stripped of political power, yes, but alive in a way that cannot be measured by territory or armies. Now, if this story moved you and you want to understand how the Sokoto Caliphate was born in the first place, we have already done the deep work for you. On this channel, we published a full video on the Fulani conquest of Hausaland, the jihad, the battles, the men who carried it out, and the moment everything changed. The title is How Usman Dan Fodio Changed West Africa Forever. It will answer every question this video just raised in your mind. The link is on your screen right now. Go watch it next, you will not regret it. And if you are new here, this is what we do on Edu History TV. We tell African history the way it deserves to be told, with names, dates, places, and the full weight of what actually happened. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.